Every species in the galaxy knew the rule, and every species taught it to their children before they could even walk or crawl or slither across the nursery floor. Do not enter human space. This was not a suggestion, and it was not a gentle warning that could be ignored by those who thought themselves brave or powerful or clever enough to test the boundaries of what was forbidden. The beacons that surrounded Terran territory broadcast their message in 4,000 different languages, reaching every corner of known space with their cold and simple words that carried no emotion and no threat and no promise of mercy or violence, just facts that spoke for themselves in ways that made even the mightiest admirals pause before their navigation charts. The messages listed coordinates of ships that had crossed the boundary, followed by the time they entered, and then nothing else at all, because there was never anything else to report after a vessel passed into that dark and silent region of stars that belonged to the humans alone. Entry, and then silence. That was all the beacons ever recorded, and that was all anyone needed to know about what waited on the other side. Commander Valith Sorn of the Kethvari Dominion had studied these records for 30 cycles of her homeworld's long orbit around its dying sun, and she had memorized every detail of every ship that had vanished into the void that the humans called their own. Her species had once been proud and foolish enough to send an armada of 12 dreadnoughts into human space, believing that their superior numbers and their advanced weapons and their warrior traditions would be enough to establish what they called diplomatic presence in the territory of these strange and soft-looking creatures. The Galactic Concord received telemetry from that fleet for exactly 9 minutes after it crossed the boundary, and then there was nothing but static that stretched on forever like the silence between stars. No debris was ever found floating in the cold vacuum where the ship should have been, and no distress signals ever reached the listening post that waited with growing dread for any sign of what had happened to those 12 mighty vessels and their crews of 10,000 warriors each. They were simply gone, as if they had never existed at all, and the only proof that they had ever been real was the entry in the beacon's endless log of ships that went in but never came out. Valith stood on the bridge of her vessel now, watching the boundary line approach on her display screen with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that warred inside her chest like two animals fighting for control of her hearts. Her ship was not a dreadnought bristling with weapons and filled with soldiers, hungry for glory and conquest. It was a medical frigate called the Mercy's Wing, and it carried no weapons at all because it had been built for healing rather than destruction. Behind her, in cargo holds that had never been designed to carry living beings, 400 refugees huddled together in the dark and tried not to think about what might be waiting for them on the other side of the line that no one was supposed to cross. These were survivors of the Dominion Civil War, families who had lost everything when the new Audarch rose to power and declared that all who had served the old government were enemies of the state who deserved nothing but death. Children clung to their mothers in those cramped and crowded spaces, and elders who had lived through 100 cycles of peace now trembled with fear at the sounds of the ship's engines, pushing them closer and closer to the forbidden zone. Valith had promised them safety, but she knew that her promise might be worth nothing at all if the stories about human space were true. Her second officer, a young male named Korath, who had lost his entire family to the Autarch's purges, stepped up beside her and spoke in a voice that shook only slightly despite his obvious terror. "Commander, we are approaching the final beacon. Shall I reduce speed so that we might reconsider our course of action?" Valith turned her large eyes toward him and saw the fear written across his face like words carved into stone. And she understood that fear because she felt it burning in her own chest with every beat of her twin hearts. "No," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands trembled where they gripped the railing of the command platform. We will not slow down because there is nothing behind us except death. And whatever waits ahead cannot be worse than what we are fleeing. The final beacon loomed on their screens now. A small satellite that hung in the void like a guardian at the gates of some ancient fortress, broadcasting its warning to all who approached with their foolish dreams of conquest or exploration. Valith listened to the message one last time as it played through the bridge speakers in the clicking and hissing language of her people. You are approaching the boundary of Terran sovereign territory. All vessels that cross this line do so with full knowledge that the Terran government accepts no responsibility for their safety or their survival. Entry is permitted, but departure is not guaranteed. This message serves as your final warning. The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, and every officer on the bridge held their breath as they waited for their commander to make the choice that would decide their fate. Valith thought about the children in the cargo hold, and she thought about the mothers who held them close, and she thought about the elders who had already lost everything except their lives, and she knew that turning back would mean delivering all of them into the hands of an Audarch who would show no mercy. All hands, she said, her voice ringing across the ship through the intercom system. Prepare for boundary crossing. May whatever gods watch over travelers in the dark have pity on us all. She gave the order with a wave of her clawed hand, and the Mercy's wings surged forward across the invisible line that separated the known galaxy from the realm of nightmares and legends. The beacons behind them went silent one by one, their warnings fading into nothing as if the ship had passed beyond the reach of everything familiar and safe. For a long moment, nothing happened at all, and Valith allowed herself to hope that perhaps the stories were exaggerated, that perhaps the humans had better things to do than hunt down every ship that wandered into their territory. But then Korath made a sound that was half gasp and half whimper, and Valith turned to look at what had appeared on the sensor display. 3 contacts had materialized around the Mercy's wing in a perfect triangular formation, and the sensors could not explain where they had come from because there had been no energy signatures and no fold space distortions and no warning of any kind. The human ships had simply appeared as if they had always been there, waiting in the darkness like predators who had infinite patience and absolute confidence in their ability to catch whatever prey stumbled into their hunting grounds. Valith stared at the display and felt her blood run cold as she realized that the stories had not been exaggerated at all, if anything. They had failed to capture the true horror of what it meant to be noticed by the creatures who lived in this forbidden space. The human vessels were matte black and angular, shaped in ways that seemed to reject the very concept of beauty or elegance, built for nothing except efficiency and destruction. They made no sound on any frequency, and they sent no hails or warnings or demands. They simply held their positions around the little medical frigate, like wolves surrounding a wounded animal that had wandered too far from its herd. Somewhere in the cargo holds, a child began to cry, and the sound echoed through the silent bridge like a prayer offered to gods who might not be listening. Valith straightened her spine and lifted her head, determined to face whatever came next with the dignity that her rank demanded, even if that dignity was all she had left to offer her people. Open a channel, she commanded, and her voice did not waver even though her hearts were pounding so hard she thought they might burst. Broadcast our situation on all frequencies and pray that something out there is willing to listen. The communications officer obeyed, and Valith's words flew out into the void, carrying with them the last hope of 400 souls who had bet everything on the mercy of monsters. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though the chronometer on the bridge showed that only 12 minutes had passed since the human ships appeared around the Mercy's wing like shadows given solid form. Valith had broadcast her message 3 times now, explaining in every language she knew that her vessel carried refugees and not soldiers, that they were fleeing genocide and not seeking conquest. that they came with empty hands and desperate hearts. The human ships did not respond with words or weapons. They simply held their positions in that perfect triangular formation, watching and waiting with a patience that seemed almost supernatural in its absolute stillness. Korath leaned close to his commander and whispered as if he feared the humans might somehow hear him through the vacuum of space. Perhaps they are deciding what to do with us. Perhaps they are debating whether to destroy us quickly or slowly. Valith did not answer because she had no answers to give, and she knew that speculation would only feed the terror that was already spreading through her crew like a sickness that infected everyone it touched. Then something changed on the sensor display, and every officer on the bridge made sounds of alarm as they watched one of the human ships begin to move. The vessel on the right side of the formation slid forward through the void with a smoothness that seemed almost organic, as if it were a living creature swimming through dark water rather than a machine built from metal and fire. It came closer and closer to the Mercy's wing until it was near enough that Valith could see details on its hull through the main viewport angular plates of some material that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it, covered with symbols that meant nothing to her alien eyes. And then the human ship did something that no Kethvari had ever witnessed in all the long history of encounters between their species. It turned on its lights. Soft white illumination blazed from panels along the vessel's sides, and what had been a shape of pure darkness became something almost welcoming, like a house on a hill with windows glowing warm against the night. A docking tube extended from the human ship toward the Mercy's wing, reaching across the gap between them like a hand offered in greeting, or perhaps in preparation to grab and hold and never let go. Valith's communications officer spoke with a voice that cracked with disbelief. "Commander, we are receiving a transmission audio, only they want to board us." "Let them," Valith said, because what choice did she have when 3 warships surrounded her unarmed vessel, and the only alternative to cooperation was a death that would come too fast for anyone to even scream. The docking procedure took only minutes, and then the airlock at the rear of the bridge hissed open to reveal a figure that made everyone on deck step back in instinctive fear. The human was smaller than Valith had expected, shorter than a Kethvari warrior by at least a full head, with soft pink skin that showed no scales or armor plating, and hands that ended in blunt fingers rather than the claws that her people used for both greeting and killing. He wore a uniform of dark blue fabric marked with symbols that presumably indicated his rank and unit, and a small device attached to his collar glowed faintly as he stepped onto the bridge and looked around with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I am Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb," the human said, and his voice came through the translation device in perfectly accented Kethvari that sounded strange coming from such an alien mouth. "Search and Rescue Division of the Terran Border Fleet. You have crossed into sovereign human territory without authorization." Valith stepped forward to face him, forcing herself to meet those strange round eyes that had no protective membranes and no secondary lids. Just wet orbs of white and brown that stared at her with an intensity she could not read. "I am Commander Valith Sorn," she said, keeping her voice steady through pure force of will. "And I know what we have done. We crossed your boundary with full knowledge of the warnings that your beacons broadcast." The human called Webb tilted his head slightly, and Valith realized that this gesture must mean something in his species' body language, though she could not guess what. 400 life signs in your cargo holds," he said. And it was not a question, because he clearly already knew everything about her ship and its passengers. Non-combatants by their biological profiles, elderly. Young, family groups. You were running from something. "Yes," Valith admitted, because lying seemed pointless when dealing with creatures who could detect the number of hearts beating in her vessel. "We are fleeing the new government of the Dominion, which has declared all of us enemies of the state, deserving only execution." Webb was silent for a moment, and Valeth watched his face for any sign of what he might be thinking. But human expressions were strange and difficult to interpret, with their mobile lips and their hairless brows that moved in ways no Kethvari face could match. "You know what happens to ships that enter our space," he said finally, and his voice carried no emotion that she could identify. "You know that no vessel has ever been seen leaving after crossing the boundary, and yet you came anyway." Valeth drew herself up to her full height, which put her eyes level with the top of the human's head, and she spoke with all the dignity she could muster. "We did not come to leave. We came because staying meant death for everyone aboard this ship, and we would rather face whatever awaits us here than return to certain slaughter at the hands of our own people." The human stared at her for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, and Valeth felt her heart's pounding against her ribs as she waited for judgment to fall upon her and everyone she had sworn to protect. Then Webb smiled, and Valeth felt her blood freeze in her veins, because humans bared their teeth when they were pleased. And the sight of those flat white squares arranged in rows was one of the most terrifying things she had ever witnessed. "Good answer," the human said, and his voice had changed somehow, becoming warmer and less flat in a way that the translator struggled to convey. "That is exactly what we needed to hear from you." Valeth blinked all four of her eyes in confusion, because this was not what she had expected. Not what any of the stories had prepared her for. Not what the legends of human brutality had led her to believe would happen. "I do not understand," she admitted, because honesty seemed like the only safe path when dealing with creatures who could apparently read intentions as easily as they read sensor data. Webb turned and gestured toward the airlock through which he had entered. "Follow me." "Commander, I am going to show you something that very few outsiders have ever seen, and I think it will answer all of the questions you are too afraid to ask." He began walking toward the airlock, and Valeth hesitated for only a heartbeat before following him, leaving her bridge crew behind with expressions of shock and terror frozen on their faces. As she stepped through the docking tube and into the human vessel, Valeth realized that she was about to learn the truth that the rest of the galaxy had wondered about for centuries. The truth about what really happened to ships that entered human space and never came out. The interior of the human ship was nothing like she had imagined, with soft lighting and clean corridors and air that smelled faintly of something green and growing. Webb led her through passageways that hummed with quiet power, past crew members who glanced at her with curiosity rather than hostility, until they reached a large viewport that looked out into the darkness of space. "Look," the human said, pointing towards something in the distance that Valeth could not quite make out at first. And then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it. And she understood why no one ever left human space, not because they were destroyed, but because of something far more unexpected. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. Webb smiled again, but this time the expression seemed almost kind. "That, Commander Sarn, is your new home if you want it." The human convoy moved deeper into Terran space, and Valeth watched through the viewport with eyes that could not believe what they were seeing as the truth of this forbidden region slowly revealed itself. She stood on the observation deck of Webb's ship while her own vessel, the Mercy's Wing, followed behind under the guidance of human pilots who had come aboard to help navigate the complex routes through territory that no outsider had ever mapped. The refugees in their cargo holds had been given food and water and medicine by human medical teams who asked no questions and demanded no payment, treating the wounded and the sick with a gentle efficiency that seemed completely at odds with everything the galaxy believed about these terrifying creatures. But it was what lay outside the ship that truly shattered everything Valeth thought. She knew about humans and their mysterious realm of silence and fear. The convoy passed through a region that Webb called the Wreckage Line, and Valeth felt her heart clench with horror as she saw the shattered remains of 1,000 alien warships floating in the eternal cold of space. HFY dreadnoughts hung broken and dead among the stars, their hulls torn open like the shells of creatures that had been devoured by predators too powerful to resist. Zorvathi battle cruisers drifted in pieces, their once proud emblems still visible on fragments of armor that tumbled slowly through the void without purpose or direction. And there, stretching across a field of debris that seemed to go on forever, were the crystalline bodies of the silicate hegemony, millions of them, frozen in the positions they had held when death came for them faster than their advanced minds could process. The hegemony sent 30 million soldiers through 6 different invasion corridors, Webb said, his voice calm and flat as if he were describing something no more significant than the weather on a distant moon. They believed that their collective intelligence would allow them to overwhelm any defense we could mount. Velith stared at the field of frozen crystal corpses and felt something cold settle into her chest. "What happened to them?" she asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. "We stopped them," Webb replied simply. "It took us 11 days to eliminate their entire invasion force, and we did not lose a single human life in the process. Our automated defense systems handled most of the work while our crews watched from safe distances." Velith turned to look at the human beside her, trying to understand how such a small and soft-looking creature could speak of such devastation with so little emotion. "Why do you keep the wreckage here?" she asked. "Why not clean it up and let the void reclaim what remains of your enemies?" Webb smiled that terrifying smile of bared teeth, but there was something sad in his eyes that the expression could not hide. "It serves as a reminder," he said, "both to us and to anyone who might think about trying again. We do not start wars, Commander Son, but we finish them and we make sure that anyone who sees what we left behind will think very carefully before raising weapons against us." The convoy continued past the wreckage line, and Velith thought that surely nothing could surprise her anymore after seeing the graveyard of failed invaders that stretched across light years of space. But she was wrong. The ships passed through some kind of sensor barrier that made her scales tingle with strange energy. And suddenly, the view outside the viewport changed completely. Where there had been darkness and death, now there was light and life on a scale that made Velith gasp with wonder and disbelief. Thousands of stations orbited vibrant worlds that glowed with the colors of healthy atmospheres and thriving ecosystems. Ships of 100 different species moved freely between these stations, carrying goods and passengers, and hope from one point to another in patterns that spoke of trade and cooperation rather than conflict. Velith recognized some of the vessel designs from her studies of galactic history, Zorvathi trading ships with their distinctive curved hulls, silicate transport pods that still carried the crystalline crews who had chosen to defect rather than die with their hegemony, and there, unmistakable despite how far they were from home, HFY agricultural vessels with the old governments, markings still visible on their sides. "I do not understand," she whispered, pressing her hands against the transparent surface of the viewport, as if she could somehow reach through it and touch the impossible scene before her. "These are refugees. These are exiles from species that the galaxy believes were destroyed by human aggression." Webb nodded, and his expression had softened into something that almost looked like pride. "This is the interior," he said, "the heart of human space that no one outside these borders knows about. This is where we bring everyone who crosses the boundary with the right intentions." Velith turned to face him, her mind struggling to process everything she was seeing and hearing. "The right intentions," she repeated. "What does that mean? How do you know who deserves to enter and who deserves to die?" Webb led her away from the viewport and into a comfortable room where chairs had been arranged around a table covered with food and drink from a dozen different worlds. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair that had been adjusted to accommodate her larger frame, "and I will explain what the beacons cannot say, what the galaxy must never know, until they are ready to understand. Vaelith sat, and Webb poured her a cup of something warm that smelled like herbs from her homeworld. And she wondered how the humans had known what she might like to drink. The warnings at our border are not meant to keep everyone out, Webb began, settling into his own chair across from her. They are meant to filter who comes in. We do not want conquerors or tourists or diplomats playing political games. He took a sip from his own cup and continued. We want people like you. Commander people who have nowhere else to go. People who are willing to give up everything they knew in order to find safety for themselves and their families. Vaelith felt tears forming in her eyes, an embarrassing physical reaction that she could not control. Why? She asked, and her voice cracked on the single word. Why would you do this? Why would you build a sanctuary for the lost and desperate of the galaxy when you could simply close your borders and let the universe burn itself out? Webb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. Because we were lost once too long ago, before we reached the stars. Humans almost destroyed themselves 100 different times with wars and hatred and fear of anything different. He looked out the window at the thriving civilization that filled the void with light and life. We learned from our mistakes, he said. We decided that we would never again let fear drive us to destroy what we did not understand, and we decided that we would offer shelter to anyone who needed it, as long as they came in peace. Vaelith thought about the children in her cargo holds, the mothers who had held them through the terror of the boundary crossing, the elders who had lost everything except the thin thread of hope that had led them here. And the price, she asked, because nothing in her experience had ever come without cost. What do you demand from those who accept your shelter? Webb smiled, and this time the expression did not seem terrifying at all. Only one thing, he said, that you become part of what we are building here, not as subjects or servants, but as partners who contribute what they can and receive what they need. He leaned forward, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that seemed to look straight into her soul. Your people have knowledge of biological engineering that could help us create crops that grow in any environment. Others bring mathematics or art or philosophy, or skills we have not yet imagined. Webb sat back and spread his hands in a gesture that seemed to encompass everything outside the window. Together, we are building something the galaxy has never seen before. Civilization that chooses its members based on their intentions rather than their species, and protects them absolutely against anyone who would do them harm. Vaelith felt the last of her fear melt away, replaced by something warm and bright that she had not felt since she was a child safe in her mother's arms. And if the Dominion comes looking for us, she asked, though she already knew what the answer would be. Webb's smile faded, and something hard and cold flickered behind his eyes for just a moment before vanishing again. Then the Dominion will learn why the Silicate hegemony no longer exists as a military power, he said, and their wreckage will join the rest of the monument we have built at our borders. Vaelith nodded slowly, understanding at last why no one ever left human space. It was not because they were killed, it was because they had finally found a home worth staying in forever. 6 months had passed since the Mercy's wing crossed into human space, and Vaelith barely recognized herself when she looked in the mirror each morning. The fear that had lived in her chest for so long had finally faded away, replaced by something she had almost forgotten how to feel peace. Her people had been given a moon to call their own, a small world orbiting a yellow star that the humans called Saw-7, but that the Kethvari had renamed New Kethvar in honor of the home they could never return to. The moon had been terraformed centuries ago by human engineers who seemed to view the reshaping of entire worlds as a simple afternoon project. As forests and oceans and mountains felt almost like the planet Vaelith had been born on so many cycles ago. The 400 refugees who had huddled in terror in the cargo holds of a medical frigate now lived in homes, built with human materials and HFY designs. A blend of two cultures that somehow created something more beautiful than either could have made alone. Children who had known nothing but war and fear now played in parks, where flowers from a dozen different worlds bloomed in colors that no HFY eye had ever seen before. Elders who had expected to die in exile now taught the young ones about the traditions and history of their people, passing down knowledge that would have been lost forever if the Audarch had succeeded in his purge. Valith had been named governor of the colony by a vote of her people, though she still wore her old military uniform because she could not quite believe that she was anything other than a soldier running from an enemy she could not defeat. But today was different from all the days that had come before, because today Valith had been summoned to a station called the Threshold for a meeting that would decide the future of her people forever. The transport that carried her through the void was piloted by a young, human woman named Sarah, who chatted cheerfully about her family and her hobbies and her dreams of one day visiting the worlds beyond. Human space. Valith found it strange that someone who lived in a civilization capable of destroying entire fleets could seem so ordinary and so happy. But she was beginning to understand that this was simply how humans were: deadly when threatened, gentle when at peace. The Threshold was the largest structure Valith had ever seen, a station that seemed to stretch across the sky like an artificial world hanging in the darkness between stars. Millions of beings lived and worked here, representatives of every species that had found sanctuary in human space, all of them contributing to the great project that the humans had been building for centuries. Sarah guided the transport to a docking bay reserved for official visitors, and Valith was met by an honor guard of soldiers from 6 different species who escorted her through corridors that hummed with the sound of countless voices, speaking in languages she did not know. The meeting chamber was located at the heart of the station, a vast room with walls made of transparent material that allowed the stars to shine in from every direction. Seated at a table in the center of this room was a human woman who looked old by the standards of her species, with silver hair pulled back from a face lined with the marks of many years and many difficult decisions. "Commander Sorn," the woman said, rising to greet Valith with a gesture that seemed both formal and genuinely welcoming. "I am Admiral Chun, and I command the defense forces of human space. Please, sit and let us talk about your future." Valith took the seat that was offered to her, and she noticed that it had been adjusted to fit her body perfectly, as if someone had measured her without her knowledge and prepared everything in advance. "I have heard of you," Valith said, because she had spent much of the past 6 months learning about the humans and their strange civilization. "They say that you have protected this territory for 40 of your years, and that no enemy has ever breached the borders while you have held command." Admiral Chun smiled, and unlike the terrifying grins that Valith had first witnessed on human faces, this expression seemed warm and genuine. 43 years, the Admiral corrected gently, "and I hope to serve for at least another decade before I pass the responsibility to someone younger, but we are not here to talk about me." She pressed a button on the table, and a holographic display appeared in the air between them, showing the symbol of the HFY people surrounded by dozens of other emblems that Valith recognized as belonging to the various refugee species who lived in human space. "You have had 6 months to settle in and to see how things work here," Admiral Chun said, "and now it is time for you to decide whether you wish to accept a compact that binds all of us together." Valith had heard whispers about the compact from other refugees, but no one had explained exactly what it meant or what it required. "Tell me," she said, leaning forward with the same intensity she had once shown when planning military operations against the Dominion's enemies. "What is this compact, and what will it cost my people to accept it?" Admiral Chun nodded, as if she had expected this question and was pleased that Valith had asked it directly. "The compact is simple," she said. "Every species that enters human space contributes to its defense, not as conscripts who are forced to fight against their will, but as partners who share both the burden and the benefits of what we have built." The holographic display changed to show images of various species working together on massive construction projects, crewing starships with mixed crews, teaching in schools where children of a dozen different kinds learn side by side. The HFY have knowledge of biological engineering that exceeds anything we have developed on our own. Admiral Chung continued. "You understand how to modify living systems in ways that could help us create crops that grow in any environment. Medicines that cure diseases we have struggled with for centuries. Tools made from organic materials that are stronger than any metal." Valith understood now what was being asked of her. "You want us to share our knowledge," she said, "to give you the secrets that our scientists spent generations developing." Admiral Chun shook her head. "Not give," she corrected. "Share. Everything you contribute becomes part of the common heritage of human space, and everything that others contribute becomes available to you as well." She gestured at the display, which now showed a HFY child sitting in a classroom with human and Zolvathi and silicate children, all of them learning together from teachers who represented every species in the coalition. "Your children will learn human engineering and Zorvathi mathematics and silicate philosophy," the Admiral said. "And in return, human and Zorvathi and silicate children will learn HFY biology and art and history. Everyone gives. Everyone receives, and together we become stronger than any of us could be alone." Valith felt tears forming in her eyes again, and this time she did not try to hide them. "And if we accept this compact," she asked, "what protection do we receive in return? What happens if the Dominion comes looking for the people they consider criminals and traitors?" Admiral Chun's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes that made Valith suddenly remember why the galaxy feared humans so much. "Then the Dominion learns why the silicate hegemony no longer exists as a military power," she said, her voice calm and flat in a way that was somehow more terrifying than any shouted threat could have been. "And their wreckage joins the monument we maintain at our borders as a warning to anyone else who might think about threatening our people." She leaned forward, and her eyes met Valith's with an intensity that seemed to reach into her very soul. "You are not guests here, Commander Sorn. If you accept the compact, you become citizens of human space, with all the rights and protections that citizenship carries." Valith thought about her people on New Kethver, about the children playing in parks, and the elders teaching in schools, and the mothers, who no longer had to fear that soldiers would come in the night to take their families away. She thought about the Autarch back in the Dominion, sitting on his throne of blood and believing that he had won, that the refugees he had driven away would die alone in the darkness between stars. And she thought about what it would mean to belong to something larger than herself, to be part of a civilization that chose its members based on their intentions rather than their species and protected them, absolutely against anyone who would do them harm. "Where do I sign?" she asked, and her voice did not waver at all. Admiral Chun smiled, and this time Valith smiled back, baring her own teeth in a gesture she had learned from the humans who had become her friends. That night, Valith signed the compact on behalf of her people. She was no longer Commander Sorn of the HFY Dominion. She was a citizen of human space, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. 3 years had passed since Valith signed the compact, and the galaxy had continued to turn without caring that everything had changed for the refugees, who had found sanctuary in human space. The Dominion had grown more aggressive under the Autarch's rule, conquering neighboring systems and absorbing smaller civilizations into its ever-expanding empire of fear and obedience. News of these conquests reached human space through the intelligence networks that monitored everything happening in the galaxy beyond the border. And Valith watched the reports with a mixture of sadness and cold anger that burned in her chest like a fire that would never go out. Her people on New Kethvar had thrived in ways she never could have imagined, building a society that blended the best of Kethvari tradition with the innovations they had learned from their human partners and the other species who shared their new home. The biological engineering techniques that her scientists developed had spread throughout human space, creating crops that could grow on barren moons and medicines that saved millions of lives. And in return, her people had gained access to technologies that made their colony one of the most advanced in the entire territory. Valith herself had risen to a position of leadership in the defense forces, commanding a cruiser that had been built with human engineering and Kethvari organic systems, working together in perfect harmony. The ship was called the Unity Shield, and its crew included humans and Kethvari and Zorvathi, and even a few silicate defectors who had chosen to serve rather than simply live in peace. She had thought, foolishly perhaps, that the Autarch had forgotten about the refugees he had driven away so long ago. But tyrants never forget those who escape their control, and 3 years was not long enough for hatred to fade from a heart as black as the one that beat in the Autarch's chest. The warning came at dawn on a day that had seemed like any other. A priority message from the Border Patrol announcing that a Dominion war fleet had been detected massing at the boundary. 200 warships hung in the void just outside the line that no one was supposed to cross, their weapons powered up and their shields at maximum strength. Valith rushed to the bridge of the Unity Shield as the alert sirens wailed throughout the vessel, and she took her command chair with a grim determination that showed on her face like a mask carved from stone. "Report," she demanded, and her tactical officer, a young human named David, who had become like a son to her, responded immediately. 217 Dominion warships at the boundary, David said, his fingers dancing across his console as he gathered information from the sensor network, including the Autarch's flagship, the Eternal Dominion. They are broadcasting demands on all frequencies. Valith felt her heart clench, with a mixture of fear and fury that she had not experienced since the day she fled her homeworld with 400 refugees who had trusted her with their lives. "Put the transmission on the main screen," she ordered, and the face of the Autarch appeared before her, sneering and triumphant and utterly convinced that he was about to achieve a great victory. "Citizens of human space," the Autarch proclaimed, his voice dripping with contempt and arrogance. "You harbor criminals and traitors who belong to the Dominion. Return them to me immediately, or face the consequences of your defiance." The transmission cut off, and Valith stared at the blank screen with eyes that burned with an anger she could barely contain. "All defense units are mobilizing," David reported. "Captain Webb is hailing us from the border command station. He wants to speak with you directly." Valith nodded, and a moment later the face of Marcus Webb appeared on her screen older now than when they had first met, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes, but still carrying that same calm intensity that had made her trust him on the day she crossed the boundary. "Governor Sorn," Webb said, because Valith still held her civilian title even while commanding a warship. "The fleet is assembling at the border. We need you there." Valith ordered her helmsman to set course for the boundary at maximum speed, and the Unity Shield leaped forward through the void with a power that made the stars themselves seem to blur. When she arrived at the boundary, she found a fleet waiting that made her heart swell with pride and wonder. Ships from every species in human space had gathered to face the Dominion threat. Kethvari, biological cruisers and Zorvathi gunships and human dreadnoughts and vessels she could not even identify. All of them crewed by beings who had chosen to stand together against those who would take their freedom away. Webb opened a channel to the Autarch's flagship, and his voice rang across the void with a calm authority that seemed completely unimpressed by the army that faced him. You have not been invited into human space. Webb said, "Turn back now, and this confrontation can end without bloodshed." The Onyx laugh echoed through every speaker on every ship in both fleets, ugly and cruel and utterly confident. "You hide behind warnings and old stories," the tyrant sneered. "My fleet will crush your pathetic defenders and take back what belongs to me by right of conquest surrender now, and perhaps I will be merciful." Webb cut the transmission without responding, and for a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then, Valith saw something on her sensors that made her gasp with shock and wonder. The human ships were flickering out of existence, vanishing from view one by one as if they were being erased from reality itself. For one terrible moment, she thought that the humans had abandoned them, that all the promises of protection had been lies designed to lure desperate refugees into a trap. But then she looked at the faces of the human crew members on her bridge, and she saw that they were smiling, those terrifying smiles that bared their teeth in expressions of fierce joy. The stars behind the Dominion fleet began to go dark, not one by one, but all at once, as if something vast and incomprehensible was moving across the cosmos and blocking out the light with its impossible mass. Valith's sensors screamed with warnings as they detected ships emerging from nowhere. Not the dozens of vessels that had gathered at the border, but thousands upon thousands of warships appearing like shadows given form and purpose. 10,000 ships, 20,000, 100,000. More vessels than the Dominion had built in its entire history, surrounding the enemy fleet completely, like the jaws of some cosmic predator closing around prey that had wandered foolishly into its hunting grounds. The Autarch's voice came through the communication system, and for the first time Valith heard fear in the tone of the tyrant who had stolen her world and murdered her people. "What is this?" he demanded. "What kind of trick are you playing? This is impossible." Webb's voice answered him, calm and cold and utterly without mercy. "You were warned," the human said. "Every beacon at our border told you what would happen if you came with hostile intentions. Did you think we were exaggerating?" The wall of human ships moved closer, and the Dominion fleet began to panic as sensors revealed the true scope of the force that had been hiding in the darkness all along. These were not the ships that patrolled the border or escorted refugees to their new homes. These were weapons of war on a scale that made everything the galaxy had ever built seem like children's toys in comparison. "This is humanity's actual fleet," Webb continued, and his voice carried across every frequency in every language. "We keep it hidden because we do not want to frighten anyone unnecessarily. But you have made it necessary." The Autarch ordered retreat, screaming commands at his captains as his flagship turned and fled toward the safety of open space. His war fleet scattered in disarray, 200 ships running in every direction like animals fleeing a forest fire, their formation shattered and their courage broken by the sight of what they had awakened. The human fleet did not fire a single shot. It did not need to. The Dominion had learned the truth that the galaxy had wondered about for centuries, and they would carry that truth back to their empire like a plague that would spread through every officer and every soldier and every citizen who heard the story of what had happened at the boundary. Human space was not defended by a handful of patrol ships hiding behind warning beacons. It was protected by a force so vast and so powerful that showing it to the galaxy would have caused panic on a scale that no government could control. The humans had hidden their true strength not out of fear, but out of mercy, because they did not want to frighten species who posed no threat, and they did not want to inspire wars of conquest by those who thought they might steal human technology. Valith watched the Dominion fleet disappear into the distance, and she felt tears streaming down her face as the tension of the past hours finally released. Webb's face appeared on her screen one more time, and he was smiling that gentle smile she had come to know so well. They will not return, he said. And the story of what they saw here today will spread throughout the galaxy. Perhaps now others will understand what our warnings truly mean. Valeth nodded, unable to speak through the emotions that choked her throat. Years later, she would tell this story to her granddaughter, a child born on New Kethver who had never known fear or war or the desperation of flight. "Why do they fear the humans so much?" the little girl asked, looking up at Valeth with eyes full of innocent curiosity. Valeth thought for a long moment before answering. "Because humans do not fight to win,